The first morning Victoria Caldwell officially ran the company, she walked into the operations center and saw a man asleep at his desk. His head was resting on his forearms. Around him, 24 monitors scrolled through amber alerts and dense log output, the kind of display that means nothing to someone who doesn't know what they're looking at, and everything to someone who does. Victoria did not ask questions. She did not look at the screens. She did not give the man a single moment to open his mouth. She read the name on the badge clipped to his lanyard, said it out loud in front of every engineer on the floor, and informed him that his employment was terminated effective immediately. The man's name was Kai Mercer. He had been at that desk for 47 hours, and by the time Victoria understood what she had just done, the payment infrastructure for one of the largest financial technology firms in the country had already begun to come apart. But to understand how we got to that morning, we need to go back. Not far, only 2 days. To the moment a man noticed something wrong that no one else in the building had seen. Meridian Pay was not a company where a slow afternoon was a minor inconvenience. It processed corporate wire transfers, transaction authentication, and high-volume payment, routing for thousands of clients across the southeastern United States, with a server infrastructure centered in a low-slung data facility on the outskirts of Nashville, Tennessee. The system ran continuously. A failure of any meaningful length carried the potential for losses that climbed into the tens of millions within hours, and the kind of reputational damage that a company could spend years trying to repair and never fully close. The infrastructure was, in the most literal sense, the company. Everything else, the executive floor, the client relations team, the branded conference rooms, and catered quarterly meetings, all of it existed in service of the machines running in that cold, humming room. Kai Mercer carried the title of Senior Infrastructure Engineer, though the title communicated almost nothing of what he actually did. He was 36 years old, quiet in the precise manner of someone who had stopped needing to announce himself long ago. He was not a tall man, and he did not carry himself like someone who expected rooms to adjust to him. He dressed in the same rotation of dark gray shirts and plain dark trousers, the kind of clothes chosen for the absence of choice they required each morning. His eyes carried the particular darkness of someone who had spent too many years sleeping too few hours, and there was always a cold cup of coffee, somewhere within arm's reach of his keyboard, that he had poured and forgotten. New employees who encountered him in the break room or in the elevator usually decided within 30 seconds that he was solid but unremarkable. The kind of person who had probably been doing the same job in the same building for 20 years and would continue doing so until he retired. The people who had actually worked alongside him held a different understanding entirely. Kai knew Meridian Pay's infrastructure the way a surgeon knows a patient they have operated on across multiple procedures over many years. He understood the old API layers that had been written nearly a decade ago and never properly replaced. He understood the failover logic that 3 successive CTOs had each promised to modernize, and none of them had touched. He knew the access control structures that had been patched manually across multiple system migrations. And he understood the fragile interdependencies that existed only because someone once built a workaround for a problem that no longer existed, but whose removal would have caused something worse than the original problem. He was, in the plainest terms, the institutional memory that the company had never thought to formally document. To the org chart, he was a line item in the technical department. To the system itself, he was the only person alive who knew where all the load-bearing walls were. Outside the office, Kai was the sole caretaker of his younger sister, Nadia, who had been living with him for 3 years, following a car accident that had left her with a partial disability requiring ongoing support. He did not speak about this at work. He had never mentioned it in a meeting, never referenced it in an email, never used it as context for anything. His personal life was not a credential he offered to people who hadn't asked. He showed up, he worked, he went home. That was the shape of his life, and he had made something that functioned like peace with it. On the other side of the building, at the very top of it, stood Victoria Caldwell, 28 years old. Freshly appointed as chief executive after the board had pushed out her predecessor following 2 consecutive quarters of disappointing earnings. Victoria had not inherited the role. She had earned her way to the shortlist through 7 years of rigorous work in financial operations consulting, where she had developed a reputation for identifying structural inefficiency and eliminating it with minimal sentiment. She was intelligent. She was organized. She communicated with a precision that people either respected or found unnerving, and she had made her peace with the fact that the two responses often came from the same room. But Meridian Pay was categorically different from anything she had done before. This was a complex, aging, high-stakes operational machine with years of compacted technical debt and a culture that had calcified around it. She was arriving during a transition the board had not fully prepared for, and the pressure to prove she was the right person, and not simply the available person, was enormous. It shaped everything she touched. She disliked visible indiscipline. It reminded her of everything she had come to fix. And in her first week, she announced a comprehensive operational review, a standardization of performance metrics across all departments, and a cultural reset she described in exact words as moving the company from comfortable to accountable. Beneath the surface of that agenda, in the lower corridors of the technical infrastructure that Victoria had not yet had time to examine in any depth, something had already begun to go wrong. 2 days before the morning that would define everything, Kai noticed something unusual in the transaction authentication logs. It was small at first. A cluster of irregular requests appearing at low frequency inside the international processing queue, mimicking the rhythm of legitimate internal traffic with enough precision that every automated filter in the system had dismissed them without a flag. But Kai saw it. The pattern was wrong in a way that was difficult to articulate immediately and impossible to ignore once you had recognized it. These requests were not trying to overwhelm the system or trigger visible errors. They were learning it. He traced the activity backward through 7 layers of log history and identified a deliberate, methodical intrusion. Someone had obtained access to a secondary service at the edge of the architecture. A low-priority authentication relay that handled a narrow subset of cross-border payment verifications. From that foothold, they had been quietly probing deeper, testing what the relay could reach, mapping a path toward more central systems. Their goal was not immediate destruction. They were waiting for the right moment, the right processing window, to either redirect funds or disable the reconciliation mechanisms entirely. Kai escalated through his direct manager. His manager, acutely aware of how poorly timed a major incident report would land in the final hours before a new CEO took her first official day, asked Kai to continue monitoring and avoid generating alarm before anything was fully confirmed. The message, delivered with every professional courtesy, amounted to a request to stay quiet and hope it resolved itself. Kai did not comply in any meaningful sense. He began building temporary isolation barriers around the segments he had identified as compromised. He constructed manual redirect layers to absorb suspicious traffic without triggering visible system failures. He hot-patched individual nodes, working through the architecture the way a person shores up a failing structure without blueprints or proper materials, with whatever is at hand, done with enough care to hold. The difficulty was that the infrastructure was ancient in technology terms. Accumulated through years of partial upgrades and emergency patches, it had evolved into something that could not be safely taken offline and cleaned. Defending it while keeping it operational simultaneously meant working without a net, on a live system, with no margin for significant error. The 47 hours that followed were the kind of sustained endurance that most people encounter only once, if ever. Kai barely left the operations floor. He drank whatever coffee was available and stopped tasting it somewhere around hour 18. He ate from vending machines when he remembered to eat at all. His colleagues saw him there continuously and registered his presence the way people register a familiar piece of furniture, assuming he was managing a routine escalation, maybe a significant one, but nothing that required them to ask. Nobody understood the scale of what he was actually doing. Kai was not patching a bug. He was keeping an entire system alive through sheer institutional knowledge and the kind of endurance that cannot be borrowed or outsourced. Late in the second night, he discovered something that changed the situation from serious to existential. The attackers had embedded a delayed activation mechanism inside the primary processing cluster. A dormant trigger. It would remain completely invisible during normal operations. It was designed to remain invisible, but it would fire automatically if anyone performed a standard system restart. Under ordinary circumstances, a restart was routine maintenance, used constantly to clear memory accumulation and resynchronize services. It was the first tool any supervisor would reach for if they saw unexpected congestion in the queue. If anyone performed that restart without knowing about the trigger, every temporary defensive layer Kaik had built would collapse. The dormant pathway would open, and the attack would enter its active phase. Kai wrote it all down. He built a file of technical notes, time-stamped log summaries, patch annotations, and explicit warnings formatted in plain language that anyone with basic system knowledge could follow. He intended to deliver these notes directly to executive leadership the moment the morning shift arrived, bypassing whatever channels were in his way. He was going to make someone understand, but the body has limits that override intention when pushed past them. Sitting before the running log display, waiting for the morning shift to arrive, Kai put his head down for one moment. He did not come back up. Victoria Caldwell arrived at the operations center at 7:38 in the morning, 52 minutes into her first official day. She was conducting a self-directed walkthrough of the company's critical infrastructure. She wanted to see the organization without filters, without the carefully assembled presentations that department heads would have prepared for a formal tour. She moved through the cold, bright floor past rows of monitors and tired engineers finishing their overnight shifts. She stopped when she reached the center console. A man in a dark gray shirt was asleep at his desk. The screens around him were alive. A mixed status indicators, amber warnings, and fast-scrolling log output that meant something specific and urgent to anyone who understood what they were looking at. Victoria did not pause to interpret them. She looked at the badge clipped to his lanyard, read the name. What she saw was a symbol of everything she had come to change. A person sleeping at the most sensitive station in the company's infrastructure was an indictment of the culture she was inheriting. Careless, unaccountable, comfortable in precisely the ways that comfort destroys companies. She did not lower her voice. Meridian Pay does not pay anyone to sleep on the job. Every engineer in earshot stopped moving. Kai lifted his head. For several seconds he was genuinely disoriented, head heavy, eyes dry and painful, the particular fog of someone surfacing from the wrong kind of sleep in the wrong kind of circumstances. He had not yet fully located himself when Victoria spoke again. He recognized her from the company announcement he had seen 2 days earlier, before any of this had started. He understood immediately what he was looking at. He spoke before she could continue. "You need to hear what I have to say about the core processing cluster. Please. I don't need to hear anything." She said it without hesitation, without pause, the way someone says a thing they have already decided. Security, collect his access card. HR, initiate termination. Kai looked at her. Not with fear, not with desperation, with the specific urgency of a person watching a preventable disaster approach from a distance that is rapidly closing. He tried once more. If someone restarts the system, Victoria had already turned her attention to the security officer moving toward him. "I've said everything I'm going to say." The room was silent. 3 engineers who had been on shift for hours, who had watched Kai stationed at that console for the better part of 2 days, said nothing. Speaking against the incoming chief executive in her first hour would have required a kind of professional courage that none of them were in a position to perform. Kai removed his badge slowly. He did not raise his voice. He did not list what he had done. He did not ask for anything. Before he walked out, he looked at a junior engineer named Garrett, standing near the secondary console, and said 4 words in a voice that several people in the room heard clearly. "Do not restart it." Someone thought he was being dramatic. Someone else assumed it was the parting remark of a man trying to make his exit mean something. Victoria registered it as nothing at all. She had already filed the morning in a folder inside her mind labeled, "First Necessary Act of Leadership." The signal that comfortable negligence was over. Kai left the building at the pace of a man with nothing left in his legs. He had not been given a single complete sentence to speak. He did not know whether the warning he had managed to leave behind would be enough to stop what was coming. He drove home on autopilot, the city moving past his windows, the way scenery moves past someone who isn't watching it. Nadia was in the kitchen when he came through the door, making tea, her left hand steadier than it used to be. She looked at him and said nothing for a moment, because she had learned to read the specific way his face went flat when something had gone wrong that he was not going to explain immediately. He said he'd been let go. She put the kettlebell down carefully and came to him and put her hand on his arm, without asking any of the questions that had immediately formed in her mind. She would ask them later. Right now, he needed to sit down. He opened his laptop on the coffee table, pulled up the remote monitoring interface from his personal credentials, which had not yet been fully deactivated in the system, and checked the current state of the infrastructure. The isolation layers were holding. The dormant trigger was still contained. The system was stable, for now in the fragile constructed way of something that has been propped up rather than repaired. He closed the laptop. He had been running for 47 hours. His body made the decision before his mind gave permission, and Kai was asleep on the couch with his jacket still on before he had decided to be. On the operations floor, the morning continued. The dashboards looked manageable from the surface. The isolation layers Kai had installed were quietly absorbing irregular traffic, keeping the most sensitive process stable in a way that was completely invisible unless you understood what you were looking at. To Victoria and the supervisors joining her morning briefings, the system running smoothly in Kai's absence seemed to confirm a certain logic. If nothing had broken, there had been nothing urgent to begin with. She moved through her scheduled meetings with precise energy, outlining expectations for each department head. She talked about accountability, structural efficiency, and the kind of operational transformation that produces measurable results within a fiscal quarter. Some people left those meetings energized. Others left with a formless unease they could not name, something they swallowed with their afternoon coffee and tried to leave in the elevator. In the technical department, the atmosphere was heavier. Several engineers had already found the internal repository folder where Kai had stored his working notes over the previous 2 days. The files were dense, written in the compressed shorthand of someone working at full speed with no time to format anything for an outside reader. There were warning annotations, patch references marked in Kai's own documentation shorthand, and several flags written in plain language that stood out even to someone who only partially understood the context. One of them read, "Do not restart Coursegraftus under any circumstances. This is not a performance EPSI. This is a staged attack waiting for a trigger. Call me first." A phone number followed. No one called it. Shortly before noon, a processing cluster began showing elevated latency, transactions backed up in the queue, taking several seconds to clear instead of fractions of a second. The on-duty supervisor, a capable man named Dennis, who had been running operational shifts at Meridian for 6 years, recognized the pattern as familiar congestion. He had seen it a dozen times. The standard response was a service restart, and a service restart had solved it every single time. As he prepared the command, Garrett, the junior engineer Kai had spoken to on his way out, looked up from his console. "He told us not to restart it," Garrett said, quietly, almost quietly enough that it wasn't said at all. Dennis's expression shifted by a fraction. "He's been terminated." He said it the way you say a thing that ends a conversation. The practical weight of institutional hierarchy applied to a dismissed employee's final words. Approximately the weight of a stranger's opinion. The restart command executed at 12:43 p.m. In the first 2 minutes, there was a misleading improvement. Queue times dropped, congestion patterns smoothed. Dennis exhaled. Someone at the back of the room said something that sounded like relief. Then the authentication tokens went asynchronous. It happened in waves. The first sign was a cluster of transaction sessions reporting unexpected state mismatches, payments showing as uninitialized, as if they had never begun. The token synchronization service had lost its connection to the primary routing pathway the moment the restart cleared the memory state where Kai's temporary logic had been running. The isolation barriers collapsed. The dormant trigger fired. What followed was quiet, technical, and deeply frightening to anyone in the room who understood the numbers appearing on the screens. Outbound transaction routing began redirecting a subset of traffic toward endpoints outside Meridian's verified network. Reconciliation for a category of corporate wire transfers failed silently. Several high-value payment instructions entered a suspended state that was neither completed nor cleanly reversible. The monitoring systems, missing the bridging logic Kai had built, could not correctly assess whether the anomalies were internal errors or active manipulation. Engineers worked at a pace that was fast enough to be impressive and not fast enough to keep up with the deterioration. They attempted rollbacks. The rollbacks did not anchor correctly because the system state they were targeting had never been formally documented. It had been a functional construction, built live, under pressure, by a single person who was no longer present. They pulled up Kai's repository notes and read them aloud to the group gathered at the primary console. The notes described the current failure mode with remarkable precision. Understanding them fully enough to reverse what was happening was a different matter entirely. Victoria was called down from the executive floor. She walked into the operations center for the second time that day and found a room that had been transformed. The monitors were overwhelmingly red. Engineers moved between stations with the tight economy of people who know exactly how serious something is and have decided not to name it plainly. Calls from enterprise clients were already coming in. She asked what was happening. A senior engineer named Priya turned from her console. Her face was composed in the way of someone who has decided to say the true thing rather than the convenient one. It looks like he was holding the entire system together by hand for 2 days. We just collapsed everything he built. The pronoun did not require clarification. Victoria asked if they could fix it. She asked who understood Kai's patch logic. She asked where the CTO was and what the CTO's working knowledge of the legacy infrastructure actually looked like. The answers she received did not comfort her. The engineers present were skilled and working hard and working at a depth that was not sufficient for what the situation required. The documentation that should have existed for systems this critical either had never been written or was years out of date. The company was bleeding, and the only person who fully understood its circulatory system had been walked out of the building 5 hours ago. Victoria sat at an empty workstation and read Kai's notes from beginning to end. The repository folder contained a consolidated log file, time-stamped patch annotations, and a plain language summary written in the field notes style of someone who had not expected to have time to revise them. At the bottom of the final page, in a font size slightly larger than the rest, was a line that had evidently been added last. If I am no longer available, do not restart the core services under any circumstances. This is not a performance issue. This is a staged attack waiting to be triggered. Call me first. He had left a phone number. Nobody had called it. The engineers around her were doing their best work. Their best work was not going to be enough, and they all knew it. Victoria closed the file. She sat for a moment with her hands flat on the desk. The feeling that arrived was not the kind that could be briefly processed and filed away. She thought about the morning, about Kai's face as he tried to speak, about the specific quality of the urgency he had been carrying, about how she had not misread it as insignificant, but had dismissed it before reading it at all. She had been so certain she understood what she was looking at that she had refused to look. She asked HR for his home address. It took several minutes of cross-referencing emergency contact records before a current address was confirmed. She called 3 times. The phone rang without answer. She picked up her keys, walked to the parking structure, and drove herself to the address on the screen. The building was in a quiet, ordinary part of East Nashville. Older construction, the kind of neighborhood where people kept their front steps swept and their window boxes watered and did not make noise about it. Victoria sat in her car for a moment after parking, registering the distance between the world she had been in for the last several hours and the world she was standing at the edge of now. She walked to the apartment door and knocked. Nothing. She knocked again, louder. She was reaching for her phone when the door opened and a young woman stood in the space it revealed. One arm slightly stiff at the side, eyes alert and assessing. She looked at Victoria the way someone looks at an unannounced visitor when they have learned to take nothing at face value. "Are you looking for Kai?" Victoria said yes. Nadia studied her for a moment, then opened the door wider. Inside the apartment, Kai was on the couch, still in his dark gray shirt from that morning, his jacket still on. One shoe had been removed at some point. The other was still on his foot. His laptop was open beside him, its lock screen cycling. A glass of water sat on the low table, untouched. He had the stillness of a person who had not chosen to stop, but had simply run out of anything left to give. Nadia crossed to him and said his name, then said it again. He came back slowly, the way people surface from the wrong side of sleep. In layers, each layer further from fully awake than it seemed. When he recognized Victoria standing in the living room of his apartment, his expression did not arrange itself into anger. It carried the specific exhaustion of someone who has just been handed one more demand they did not ask for. He sat up. He said nothing. Victoria sat in the chair across from him. She did not arrange her words carefully, or build toward anything gradually. "I didn't listen to you this morning. I terminated you before I understood what was happening. I need to apologize for that." Kai looked at her without speaking. He was not withholding his response strategically. He was simply not in a place where words changed what he was carrying. She continued, because the situation did not allow her to wait. "They restarted the system. It's failing. Nobody in the building understands your patch logic well enough to stop it." Kai closed his eyes for a moment. Not shock. Just the particular weight of being right about something you had sincerely hoped not to be right about. He reached for the laptop, pulled up the remote monitoring interface, and scanned the current metrics for less than 60 seconds before setting it back down. The numbers confirmed what Victoria's face had already communicated. He did not stand up immediately. He looked at Nadia first, asked whether she had eaten, whether she needed anything before he left, whether their neighbor, Mrs. Carver downstairs, was available if she needed something in the next few hours. Nadia answered each question with the particular patience of someone who understood that the man she was looking at was being asked to return to something difficult, and who had made the private decision not to make it harder. She said she was fine. She said go. Something passed between them that did not require words. Then Kai looked at Victoria. "I'm going back because if the breach completes, real people will pay for it. Businesses, workers, families who depend on those payment systems to function. That's why I'm going, not the apology, not the job." He stood. He changed his shirt. He said a quiet word to Nadia, picked up his laptop and his jacket, and walked to the door. He looked back at her once. Nadia gave him a small nod. The kind that means everything and takes up no space at all. Then they drove back to headquarters in silence, the Nashville skyline appearing over the highway in the afternoon light, indifferent, as cities always are to the things happening beneath them. When Kai walked back into the operations center, the room changed. Not dramatically, not with any ceremony. Something shifted in the quality of the air, the way a room changes when the person who was supposed to be in it finally walks through the door. Not celebration. Something closer to the specific relief of a group of people who have been managing a problem beyond their capacity and have just seen the person with the relevant capacity return. Kai did not acknowledge it. He moved directly to the primary console, took the seat that Priya vacated without being asked, and began a rapid assessment of current system state. He asked for full log access, current architecture diagrams, and a verbal summary of every intervention the team had attempted since the restart. He listened to the summary without interrupting. When it was finished, he was quiet for approximately 10 seconds. Then he started distributing the work. He assigned 5 engineers to isolating the anomalous outbound connections, carefully redirecting them into a controlled observation environment rather than blocking them blindly. He sent 2 people to build a mirror pathway, tracking exactly where the redirected transaction data was being channeled. He asked a 3rd group to prepare a controlled failover for the highest value processing queue. He asked someone from the legal team to reach out to Meridian's 3 largest enterprise clients with a scripted message acknowledging a temporary technical issue, worded precisely to acknowledge without triggering contractual escalation clauses. He asked one person to do nothing except record every command he issued, in order. The distribution of the work was its own kind of demonstration. He was not performing mastery. He was executing a plan he had been developing mentally for 47 hours, adapting it in real time to a situation that had deteriorated further than he had hoped. He understood this system the way only continuous intimate contact produces. Not just how it was designed to function, but how it had evolved into something different from the design, and what that evolution meant under stress. Over the following 90 minutes, the bleeding slowed. The anomalous routing pathway was severed from its connection to the core payment layer. 3 suspended high-value transactions were isolated and quarantined before any funds transferred outside Meridian's verified network. The intrusion point was identified, a vulnerability in the secondary authentication relay that the attackers had been exploiting for weeks before any of this became visible, and was neutralized through 17 specific changes to the authentication configuration that closed the door and removed the key from the lock. There were losses. Several smaller transaction batches would require manual reconciliation. 2 enterprise clients would receive formal incident notifications. The security audit that followed would be extensive and expensive. But the catastrophic outcome, a large-scale diversion of corporate funds, followed by public disclosure of a failure of that magnitude, had been averted. When Kai confirmed that the authentication layer had restabilized and the intrusion pathway was permanently closed, the room released a collective breath. Victoria, who had stood at the edge of the working area for the entire 90 minutes, felt the tension leave her in a wave that was almost dizzying. She had not moved from that spot. She had not spoken. She had watched a man rebuild the thing she had broken, and she had understood every minute of it exactly as the indictment it was. The emergency review was called within the hour. Department heads, the CTO, and the board's technical liaison gathered in the main conference room. The incident was presented in full. Kai had detected the intrusion 2 days before anyone else. He had reported it through proper channels and been effectively told to wait. He had worked for 47 consecutive hours to hold the infrastructure together. He had been terminated before he could brief the incoming CEO. His explicit written warning had been found in the system and ignored after his termination. The restart had been performed, and the result had been exactly what he predicted. Around the conference table, several people began reaching for the careful organizational language that exists for precisely these moments. Process gaps, communication breakdowns, understandable given the circumstances of a leadership transition. Victoria recognized the language because she had used it herself in other rooms. She understood its function. She understood that using it now would be a direct repetition of the failure that had produced the crisis. She stood. This morning, I terminated Kai Mercer before I had heard a single complete sentence from him. I made that decision based on an image that confirmed what I had already decided to believe. I was wrong, and my error came close to costing this company something it would not have recovered from. She looked at the room. I am sorry, to Kai, and in front of all of you. The room held the kind of quiet that settles when something true and costly has been said plainly, without the protection of institutional language. At the far end of the table, Kai gave a single small nod. He did not perform forgiveness. He did not give the room a resolution it hadn't earned. He received her words with the quiet of a person who has set something heavy down. Not because it was resolved, but because continuing to hold it served no one. What happened to Victoria Caldwell in the months that followed mattered in ways that the board never formally acknowledged, but everyone in the building eventually understood. The board's audit committee, reviewing the incident documentation in full, determined that Victoria's decision to terminate Kai without due process, particularly during a declared operational concern, represented a material governance failure in her first day of leadership. The CTO, whose own failure to escalate Kai's initial report had contributed directly to the crisis, tendered his resignation under pressure 4 weeks later. Garrett, the junior engineer who had warned against the restart, received a formal commendation and a salary review that was 6 months overdue. And Dennis, the on-duty supervisor who had ordered the restart, was placed on a formal performance improvement plan that made clear he had 1 quarter to demonstrate the judgment the role required. Victoria retained her position, but the board installed an independent operations oversight committee that reported directly to them, not to the CEO, for a period of 18 months. Every major infrastructure decision required a second review. Her authority was real but no longer unchecked. She understood what that meant. She accepted it without argument, because the alternative had been a company that no longer existed. In the weeks that followed the incident, Kai's professional standing was formally restored and substantially improved. There were offers of immediate promotion, significant compensation adjustments, and a newly created role overseeing infrastructure security operations at an organizational level that would have given him the authority his expertise had always quietly warranted. What he negotiated first, before any title or number was finalized, was a set of structural changes. He asked for a revised escalation protocol guaranteeing frontline engineers a direct path to executive leadership when reporting security concerns, a path that could not be blocked by middle management, protecting its own comfort. He asked for shift rotation standards in the operations center that made it structurally impossible for any person to become a single point of failure through exhaustion. And he asked for a formal policy protecting engineers who raised genuine risk alarms from any professional penalty for doing so. When he presented these requests to the board, the room was very still. Everyone present understood what they were looking at. A man who had been handed significant institutional leverage and had chosen to spend most of it on protections for the next person in his position. The board accepted everything without modification. Priya, the senior engineer who had been the one to tell Victoria the truth in the operations center, was promoted to deputy infrastructure director. She had been passed over for the role twice in the previous 2 years, both times in favor of candidates who interviewed well and performed adequately. She had stayed anyway because the work mattered to her and because she had not yet been given a sufficient reason to leave. The change that mattered most was not in any document. It was in how Victoria moved through the building in the months that followed. Her decisiveness remained. Her standards stayed high. But something in the texture of how she led had shifted. She began arriving in departments not to inspect but to ask questions. She learned to ask the kinds of questions that made people feel safe enough to answer honestly, which is a skill that sounds simple and requires years to develop. She slowed down in the moments that required listening. Not all of them, but the ones that mattered. And she began to recognize, with increasing reliability, the difference between someone who talked loudly about their work and someone who was quietly holding something essential together. It was not a skill she had brought to the building with her. It was one she had paid an extremely specific price to acquire. One afternoon in late November, several weeks after the incident had been formally closed, Victoria was leaving the building through the main lobby and saw Kai near the entrance. He was standing with Nadia, who had come to meet him at the end of the day. She was talking, animatedly, her left hand moving more than it used to, pointing at something down the street. And Kai was listening with the complete attention of someone who has decided that this is the most important thing happening in his world at this specific moment. His face, which Victoria had seen under pressure for an entire day and memorized as controlled and precise, was entirely different, open, easy. The kind of expression that professional competence does not produce and cannot fake. He was not a man in a building. He was himself at the end of a long day, and that was all he needed to be. Victoria stood back and did not approach immediately. She had learned, was still learning, to recognize the moments that belonged to other people. After a moment she walked over. Not as the chief executive, without any agenda at all. She said hello to Nadia, who looked at her with same clear, assessing eyes she had used in the doorway of the apartment 3 weeks earlier. She asked Kai how the week had gone. He said it had gone well. He said the new escalation protocol was already functioning. A junior engineer had flagged something small in a third-party integration layer the previous morning, and the report had reached the right desk within the hour. That's the point, he said, not with satisfaction, with something quieter than that. The matter-of-fact tone of someone describing a thing that should have always worked this way. Victoria nodded. She looked at him for a moment. There was no unresolved tension in the look, no performed warmth either. It was the look of two people who had come through something difficult from opposite sides and arrived, unexpectedly, and without planning for it, at a version of mutual understanding. For what it's worth, she said, I think about that morning every day. Kai considered that. I think that's probably useful, he said. And then, because it was true, and because he had reached the point of being able to say true things without needing them to land in any particular way, I think you'll be a better CEO because of it. I don't think you would have been otherwise. Victoria looked at him. The words settled somewhere in her chest in the specific location where honest things land. She said, thank you. He nodded once. He said good night. Nadia gave a small wave, the easy gesture of someone who has made her own assessment and found the situation acceptable. They walked out into the early winter evening and turned left on Fifth Avenue. Nadia still talking, Kai listening, the city moving around them without interest. Victoria stood in the lobby for a moment longer than she needed to. She thought about the morning. The operations center, the amber monitors, the man she had decided she understood in the time it took to read a name on a badge. She thought about what that decision had nearly cost. Not in the abstract language of quarterly losses and reputational damage, but in the specific human arithmetic of it. A man who had given 47 hours to protect something that had not protected him, who had walked out of a building with 4 words and the particular dignity of someone who has nothing left to prove. She thought about Nadia's eyes in the doorway of that apartment. The glass of water on the coffee table, untouched. The lobby was ordinary around her. The front desk, the elevator banks, the ambient hum of a building at the end of its working day. Nothing remarkable about any of it. That was the thing about the most important moments of a life. They almost never announced themselves. They arrived looking like everything else. She walked out through the front doors, and into the evening, the air cold and clean, Nashville spread out in the early dark around her. She had a lot of work ahead of her. She knew that. But she knew something now that she had not known when she walked into this building on that first morning with her certainty intact and her questions already answered. She knew that the most dangerous thing a person in her position could carry was not inexperience, not even poor judgment. It was the conviction that you could see clearly enough without ever needing to look twice. She was not going to make that mistake again. Sometimes the people the world walks past are the ones who are quietly keeping it running. Sometimes the person who looks the most unremarkable, the worn jacket, the cold coffee, the eyes that carry too many years of too little sleep, is the one who has already done the work that no one else in the room understood how to do. And sometimes the most important thing a person in authority can learn has nothing to do with strategy or efficiency or the metrics on a quarterly dashboard. Sometimes it is this, that slowing down long enough to actually hear someone, really hear them, before you have already decided what they're going to say, is not a weakness. It is the only thing that stands between a decision and a disaster. Kai Mercer did not need anyone's recognition. He had never needed it. He had shown up, done the work, and gone home. That was the shape of his life, and he had made something that functioned like peace with it. But in a cold operations center on the outskirts of Nashville, on the first morning of someone else's new beginning, he had been given the chance to show what he was actually made of. Not to the room, not to Victoria Caldwell, not to any audience at all, only to himself, and he had not hesitated for a single second. Dignity is not given, it is recognized, and the people who refuse to see it in others are the ones who lose it themselves. If this story stayed with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever witnessed someone being underestimated, only to discover who they really were? Share your story below. And if you want more stories like this, stories about ordinary people with extraordinary hidden depths, hit that subscribe button. I'll see you in the next one.